Most love stories are painted in broad, sweeping strokes. A dramatic glance across a crowded ballroom, a breathless rescue during a tempest, or a secret letter delivered by the pale light of the moon. This particular story, however, chose a much humbler beginning. It began with an argument about a chicken. It was not a metaphorical chicken, nor a symbolic one. It was a very real, very stubborn bird that belonged to Mae Whitfield. For the third time that week, the creature had defied all logic and crossed the property line onto the land belonging to Jack Calloway. Jack, a man who possessed a deep appreciation for order and the sanctity of boundaries, held the entirely reasonable opinion that a chicken displaying that much ambition ought to at least contribute to the household economy by paying rent. Mae's perspective, however, was framed quite differently. She stood on the other side of the fence, her posture radiating a kind of cheerful, deliberate precision that suggested she had been waiting for this exact confrontation with a mixture of patience and genuine anticipation. She informed him, with a tone of sweet logic, that the chicken was not, in fact, trespassing. The fence itself was simply standing in the wrong place, a mistake that had remained uncorrected since Jack's father had erected it some 20 years prior. If Jack harbored any true interest in accuracy, she suggested, he might consider the merits of moving the entire structure approximately 4 feet to the left. Jack took a moment to consider this proposal, his expression masked by a furrowed brow. He then countered with the dry, biting observation that if Mae possessed even a fleeting interest in keeping her livestock on her own designated property, she might consider the benefits of raising a chicken capable of reading a property line. Mae laughed, not a polite, measured chuckle meant to soothe, but a real, vibrant laugh that escaped before she could suppress it. It was bright, genuine, and entirely delighted by the absurdity of the moment. Jack Calloway, a man who had felt perfectly justified in his mild annoyance just 30 seconds prior, found himself doing something completely unplanned. He smiled. It was not the tight, practiced smile one offers a neighbor in passing. It was something else entirely. It was the look of a man who has just encountered something unexpected, something that has arrived on his doorstep without invitation, and he found himself gripped by the unsettling realization that he was not entirely certain what to do about this sudden, new arrival. It was a moment of shift, a silent acknowledgement that the familiar rhythm of his life had just encountered a discordant, yet strangely harmonious note that promised to change everything. The setting was Ridgeback, Montana, in the autumn of 1881. Jack Calloway was 32 years old and carried the weight of the family cattle ranch on his broad shoulders. It was 300 acres of decent grazing land, nestled on the eastern slope of the valley, featuring a solid, weather-beaten barn, a farmhouse that was perpetually in need of porch repairs, and a herd of cattle that kept them comfortable without ever tipping into true prosperity. Jack was a man of the outdoors, possessing dark, steady eyes and a face that seemed etched by the elements themselves. He was not conventionally handsome in the refined, polished way, but he possessed a rugged, honest look that, in the frontier climate of Montana, held significantly more value than mere vanity. By the quiet consensus of the town's small population, Jack was also the most stubborn man in the valley. It wasn't a mean-spirited, jagged sort of stubbornness. It was simply a form of profound certainty. He arrived at his opinions through careful, methodical thought, and he saw no logical reason to revise those conclusions in the absence of overwhelming evidence. This trait served him exceptionally well when managing a ranch, where consistency was the bedrock of survival, but in the more complex, fluid areas of life, it tended to produce mixed and sometimes comical results. Mae Whitfield was 28 and occupied the neighboring property. Her land consisted of 40 acres of high-quality soil, a kitchen garden that served as the envy of the entire county, and a mare named Duchess, who possessed as many strong opinions as her owner. Mae had managed the farm entirely on her own since the passing of her father 2 years earlier, a trial by fire that had taught her several essential, hard-won lessons. How to reset a fence post in frozen ground, how to negotiate firmly with traveling merchants who mistakenly assumed she was naive about the value of goods, and how to conduct a conversation with a man who was being willfully unreasonable without ever letting him suspect that she saw through his facade. This last specific skill had proven remarkably useful in her interactions with Jack. They had been neighbors for 2 decades, their lives separated by a fence, a narrow creek, and the long, tangled history of 2 families who managed to get along well enough while occasionally driving one another to the brink of madness. There was a fragile, unspoken agreement of mutual practical support that governed their existence. Mae had brought a fresh-baked pie over when Jack's father passed away 3 years prior, as that was the neighborly thing to do. Jack, in turn, fixed the sagging north fence of her property without being asked, because that, too, was simply the way of things in the valley. "She is a very determined bird," Mae said, her gaze fixed on the chicken as it pecked at the dry earth on Jack's side of the boundary with an air of complete, unearned satisfaction. Jack watched the animal, then shifted his eyes to Mae, his jaw tight. "That doesn't change the fact that she is trespassing, Mae," he replied, his tone firm. Mae tilted her head, a lock of hair falling across her forehead. "I would call it exploring. Honestly, Jack, you could learn a thing or two from her. She comes to a boundary, and instead of just accepting it, she asks herself if that boundary is actually serving anyone. And if the answer is no, she finds a way across." Jack didn't smile. "It's serving me, Mae. It is effectively keeping your livestock where it belongs." Mae shook her head, her expression maddeningly pleasant. "Clearly it is not, as we are having this exact conversation for the 3rd time this week." Jack looked back at the chicken. The bird peered up at him with the serene, vacant indifference of an animal that lacked any concept of property law or human agitation. It was an impossible creature. "I will build the fence higher," Jack announced, a finality in his voice that was meant to end the debate. Mae just smiled, that specific, soft expression that signaled she had already won the argument and was now choosing to be gracious about the victory. "You do that, Jack," she said. "I am sure that will solve everything." She leaned down, scooped up the chicken, tucked it under her arm with the easy, practiced grace of a woman who dealt with such things daily, and turned back toward her home. Jack watched her walk away, and for the first time he admitted to himself that she was the most aggravating person he had ever met. He thought this with a warmth that felt dangerous. The chicken incident proved to be far from an isolated annoyance. It was merely the opening chapter in what evolved over the following months into one of the most delightful and enduring disputes in the history of Ridgeback. It was never truly serious, which was the secret to its longevity. It possessed the light, rhythmic quality of a game where both players instinctively understood the rules, even if they never spoke them aloud. Each side remained fully engaged, their wits sharpened by the challenge, and yet neither party was ever genuinely angry. The entire exercise was conducted with a high-spirited energy that only exists between 2 people who, on some fundamental level, are enjoying the intellectual sparring match immensely. The chicken, seemingly emboldened by the attention, managed to cross the fence twice more in the subsequent weeks. True to his word, Jack built the fence higher, laboring under the hot sun with a grim determination. Mae, in turn, brought the chicken back both times, usually accompanied by the dry observation that she genuinely admired his steadfast commitment to a strategy that was so demonstrably failing to produce the desired results. The skirmishes soon expanded beyond the wandering poultry. There was the contentious matter of the water rights at South Creek, which necessitated a formal resolution at the county office. They spent 40 minutes in a heated, highly technical discussion with the local clerk. A session during which they managed to agree on every single practical point while simultaneously disagreeing on every underlying principle. By the time they stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk, they left the poor clerk visibly confused, unable to determine if he had just witnessed a budding romance or the beginning of a blood feud. Then there was the infamous afternoon when Jack's horse wandered into Mae's pristine kitchen garden and consumed approximately a third of her squash crop. The resulting conversation was a masterpiece of human interaction. Mae's position, delivered with icy calm, was that Jack owed her a substantial amount of squash. Jack's counter-argument, offered with a straight face, was that his horse had simply demonstrated superior taste compared to most of the guests he had hosted in years. Mae's response to that specific justification was a look of such composed, utter incredulity that Jack had to turn away quickly to avoid breaking into an uncontrollable laugh. He paid for the squash, of course. He paid double, because it felt like the only appropriate response to a woman who could dismantle his pride with a single raised eyebrow. The town naturally began to notice. Small towns are like living, breathing organisms that possess an inherent, almost supernatural relationship with information. Gossip in Ridgeback moved faster than a startled horse and arrived with greater accuracy than the telegraph, usually accompanied by a layer of unsolicited commentary. The prevailing rumor circulating through the dry goods store and the local tavern was that Jack Calloway and Mae Whitfield were either on the precipice of an historic marriage or were engaged in a feud of biblical proportions. The town was divided into two distinct camps, each fiercely defending their chosen interpretation. Martha Deere, who operated the dry goods store and possessed an unshakable opinion on every matter of local importance, held firmly to the marriage theory. "I have seen the way he watches her when he thinks she isn't looking," she would proclaim to anyone browsing her shelves. "That man is gone, deep in it, and he is the only one in the valley who hasn't realized it yet." Conversely, old Pete, who had known the Calloway and Whitfield families for over 30 years, took the feud position. He argued that both bloodlines were notoriously headstrong and that the apple never fell far from the tree. The eventual consensus in town was that both possibilities were likely true, and the residents would simply have to wait and see which outcome won out. Mae was not entirely oblivious to the speculation. She was not a woman who generally paid much attention to the chatter of others. Her years spent running the farm alone had taught her that the opinions of neighbors regarding her choices were rarely helpful and frequently quite wrong. However, she was profoundly honest with herself. She liked Jack Calloway, and she reached the realization that she liked him not in spite of their frequent arguments, but precisely because of them. He never spoke down to her. He never diluted his genuine convictions to be polite, and he never treated her as a woman who needed to be managed or protected. When he disagreed with her, which happened with enviable regularity, he stated his position directly and expected her to fire back, which she always did. In their own strange way, this felt like a deeper form of respect than any quantity of careful, hollow courtesies could ever offer. She liked his laugh, which was rare and deep. She liked the way he processed information with a deliberate, steady speed, holding his conclusions with a firm grip. Most of all, she liked that he had paid double for the squash without being asked. She was, however, far too proud to be the one to voice any of these feelings first. She had her principles, and she intended to stand by them. It was October when the turning point finally arrived at the annual harvest social held in the Ridgeback Grange Hall. The room was filled with the rhythmic sound of fiddles, the smell of roasted meats, and the warm, lingering atmosphere of a community that had survived another grueling summer and was feeling uncharacteristically generous. Mae was in attendance with her friend Ruth. Jack was there as well, largely because his friend Tom had spent the previous week pestering him about spending too much time in isolation, a pattern of unsolicited advice that Jack was receiving from every corner of the valley. They found each other in the crowded room, as they inevitably did, without even searching. "Mae," he said, stepping into her personal space. "Jack," she replied, her tone cool but expectant. "Did that chicken behave herself this week?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Exemplary," Mae agreed, folding her arms. "I believe she has lost interest now that you built the fence so much higher, or perhaps she is merely plotting something more ambitious." Jack looked down at her, his expression softening. "I shall keep a close eye on the south section, just to be safe." They stood together at the edge of the dance floor, speaking with the fluid rhythm of two people whose conversations had developed their own unique grammar over months of constant practice. They were, in that moment, a world unto themselves. A young man named Carter, a newcomer to Ridgeback who was not yet initiated into the established social hierarchy, wandered over and asked Mae to dance. Mae glanced at Jack, a momentary flickering of intent in her eyes. Jack watched Carter approach with the look of a man who had just discovered something he did not particularly welcome and was currently deciding exactly what to do about it. He recovered with admirable speed, offering a practiced smile. "Go ahead," he said, his tone sounding almost light-hearted. At this current rate, Mae, you will never get married. You really should take every single opportunity that presents itself." He meant for it to be a joke, the kind of friendly, teasing banter they traded constantly, the kind that had become their specific language. However, the moment the words left his mouth, he felt the air shift. Mae looked at him, and something in her expression changed, settling into a look of quiet, searing clarity. She took one small step closer to him, closing the distance between them, and murmured, "Not unless you ask." She then turned toward the flustered Carter, smiled with genuine, polite warmth, and said, "Thank you, but I think I will sit this one out." She walked away toward the refreshment table with the composed grace of a woman who had just dropped a stone into a deep, dark pool. Jack stood rooted to the floor where she had left him. Carter hovered awkwardly, looking between the two of them. "Was that—" he began. "Go find someone else to dance with," Jack said, his voice clipped and intense. He was watching Mae's back as she stood at the refreshment table. She didn't look back once. He was consumed by the weight of those 3 words, delivered with a smile and a step, and the particular, terrifying calm of a woman who had just said exactly what she meant and was perfectly comfortable with the aftermath. He needed to get out. He walked home under the immense, unblinking dome of the Montana sky, not because his house was far, but because he desperately needed the space to breathe. "Not unless you ask." The words tumbled around his mind, turning over the way he turned over everything, carefully, from every single angle, with the honest, frustrating stubbornness that served as his greatest virtue and his most inconvenient flaw. She had been saying it for months, he realized, just never in words. It was in the way she lingered at the fence line long after their business was settled, in the way she laughed at his observations when others found them merely adequate, and in the way she had looked at him across the dance floor. He stopped walking in the middle of the quiet, dusty road. The stars were brilliant, cold and infinite, scattered across the horizon like spilled salt on a dark table. He revisited every moment, the chicken, the ruined squash, the heated arguments over water rights, and those 11 separate visits to the South Creek. He thought about the lamp in her window that he had started looking for every single evening, without ever really admitting to himself that he was doing it. He thought about Carter, and he recognized that specific, sharp quality of the jealousy he had felt watching the young man walk toward her. That feeling had a name, and he had been meticulously avoiding giving it a name for months, the same way one avoids looking directly into a bright light, because they know that once they truly see it, they can never unsee it. He forced himself to look at it now. He stood in the road for a long time, the silence of the valley pressing in on him. Then he walked the rest of the way home, sat at his kitchen table, and spent the remainder of the night contemplating how a man who prided himself on his directness had managed to be this thoroughly, catastrophically indirect for this long. The answer, he eventually concluded, was simple. He had been terrified. It was a deeply uncomfortable thing to conclude about yourself at 32, under the vast, uncaring stars of Montana. He didn't sleep, but by the time the sun began to bleed over the eastern ridge, he had a plan. He went to her property on a Sunday morning, but he did not bring flowers. That felt too much like a performance, and Jack Calloway did not perform. He went with a heavy fence post and a post hole digger because the southeast corner of her fence had been soft since July, and he had been meaning to fix it for weeks. It felt like a perfectly reasonable, practical excuse to be exactly where he wanted to be. Mae was in her kitchen garden when he arrived, the morning light catching the dust in the air around her. She looked at the post hole digger, then at him. "Southeast corner," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "I have been meaning to get to that myself." "I will do it," he said. "You don't have to," she countered, though they both knew the routine. "I know," he said. The corner of her mouth twitched, a tiny, betraying movement. He got to work. She brought him coffee after a while. They sat on the low, weathered fence rail in the crisp October air and drank it in a comfortable, heavy silence that had always been available to them, a silence that felt like genuine company rather than an absence of words. Finally, Jack set his cup down on the wood. "I have been thinking about what you said at the social," he said. "Have you?" she asked, her voice deliberately neutral, giving him absolutely nothing. "I was slow," he said, staring out at the valley. "I want to acknowledge that directly. I was considerably slower than I should have been, given that you have been—" He paused, searching for the right words, feeling the weight of the moment. "Quite clear in retrospect for some time." "Several months," she added helpfully. "Several months," he agreed. "I was going to say I had good reasons, but they are not very good reasons, and you have a reliable instinct for bad reasoning, so I will not waste your time." She turned to look at him, her expression shifting, amused, patient, and something much warmer underneath. "What I want to say," he continued, "is that I would like to come calling on you properly, if you are willing. Starting with supper this week, if that suits." "It suits," she said. "Then, Jack?" "Yes." That was the least romantic declaration of intent I have ever heard in my life. He looked at her. "Was it wrong?" "No," she said softly. "It was exactly right. Which is, I suppose, why I have been waiting for it." The courtship that followed was, by the general consensus of Ridgeback, the most entertaining exhibition of romance in living memory. It was far from smooth, as neither Jack nor Mae was capable of abandoning their fundamental nature for the sake of appearances. They engaged in fierce debates regarding the optimal storage of winter grain, and a disagreement over horse management lasted 3 full days, resolving only when Mae's mare did exactly what Mae had predicted. At that point, Jack conceded with the measured, steady grace of a man who had finally learned that surrendering to Mae Whitfield was not nearly as painful as he had anticipated. Between these skirmishes, they shared suppers that stretched for hours because the conversation simply refused to reach a conclusion. They rode out on Sunday afternoons, discussing the ranch, their future, and the small, mundane details that gradually accumulate into a shared life. They discovered that they agreed on almost everything that truly mattered, and disagreed on the trivialities, which Mae observed was likely the ideal arrangement for a lasting marriage. It was in December, on her own porch, that Jack finally asked her. The evening was cold and crystalline, with the first light dusting of snow upon the mountains and the final embers of the sunset painting the sky in deep violets and golds. He had entertained the idea of an elaborate romantic setting, but he discarded every option as being fundamentally inconsistent with everything he knew about Mae. She possessed no patience for things that prioritized presentation over genuine content. He sat in the chair beside hers, the chairs they had occupied throughout the autumn, which had become, without any formal declaration, their own, and turned to look at her. "Mae," he said, his voice dropping, "I need to ask you something." "You need to ask me several things on a regular basis," she replied, without looking up from her mug of coffee. "Be specific." He took a breath. "I need to ask you to marry me." She slowly looked up, meeting his gaze. He held it firmly, looking at the woman who had argued with him about chickens and water rights, who had made him laugh more in 6 months than in the previous 3 years, and who had whispered that challenge at the dance. "I am not going to be poetic about it," Jack admitted. "You would see through it anyway. What I know is that I want to argue with you for the rest of my life, sit on this porch, fix your fence posts, and lose approximately 40% of our disagreements." Mae arched a brow. 50%, she corrected him. 40, he said firmly. She studied his face for a long, quiet moment, her eyes searching for the truth of him before she finally smiled. "Did you just try to negotiate the terms of your own marriage proposal?" "I am establishing an accurate baseline," he replied. She let out that real, vibrant laugh, the one that had started everything that October evening, bright, genuine, and entirely delighted. She set down her coffee, her expression softening into something raw and beautiful. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Obviously, yes. It took you long enough." "I was thinking it through," he countered, though he was smiling now. "You are always thinking things through," she murmured, leaning closer. "And yet, here I am." "Here you are," she said softly. Finally. They were married in April, when the valley shook off the frost and turned a vibrant, hopeful green. The ceremony was held at the Ridgeback Church, small and genuine, attended only by those who truly mattered. Mae wore a cream-coloured dress her mother had stitched years before, kept in a trunk for an occasion her mother had apparently been more confident about than Mae had ever been. Jack stood at the front of the church, watching her walk down the aisle, and he was struck by the sudden, profound clarity that every argument they had shared was simply a conversation he never wanted to end. They combined their properties, which necessitated several intensely practical, often argumentative discussions about land management. These talks were always resolved, not because one of them gave up, but because they found the truth in the middle. The ranch thrived, the kitchen garden expanded, and the bookkeeping, which Mae took over entirely, became far more organized, a fact Jack acknowledged without resistance because her numbers were simply correct. They were not a perfect couple, they were a real one, built on the solid, unshakable foundation of honesty. Their first child, a boy named Robert, arrived in the second year, possessing his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's sharp, analytical wit. A daughter, Helen, followed 4 years later, quiet and watchful with her mother's dry humor and her father's steady patience. The years settled into the steady rhythm of a life constructed by two people who were genuinely, deeply good at being together. They never performed for the town or for their children, they simply lived. The chicken, for the record, lived to a truly implausible age and was buried with some ceremony in the garden, a final point of contention that Jack maintained was excessive and Mae maintained was entirely appropriate. They disagreed about the bird until the very end. The summer of 1931 arrived, and the valley had seen many seasons of prosperity and hardship. The barn had been rebuilt, the porch repaired, and the children had grown and moved on to lives of their own. Jack was 82, and Mae was 78. They sat on the porch as the sun began its slow, golden descent behind the mountains, the same view they had shared for half a century. Jack held a cup of coffee, and Mae held tea, a point of mild, playful contention for over 40 years. "You know," Jack said, his voice thinner now but carrying the same conviction, "coffee is objectively the superior choice in the evening." "You have been saying that for 50 years, Jack," Mae said, her voice a soft, melodic echo of her youth. "It has not become less true." "It has not become more true either," she replied with a gentle, lingering smile. He looked at her, seeing not just the silver in her hair or the lines etched by 80 years of weather and laughter, but the same woman who had challenged him at the fence line in 1881. "I have been thinking," he said. "Dangerous," she teased. "I was thinking that I was right that October at the social. You really would not have married me if I hadn't asked." She reached over and took his hand, her skin soft and familiar beneath his own. "Are you still trying to claim credit for our marriage on a technicality?" "I am merely establishing the accurate historical record," he insisted. She laughed, and the sound was just as bright and delighted as it had been on that first day. They sat in the golden light, two people who had argued about everything under the sun, and in doing so had found everything that mattered, holding hands as the world went quiet.